Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Galucki. Welcome to the 562nd Imagine Buffalo program and our 183rd YouTube program hosted by our wonderful Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Thanks for joining us today. This program is created by the Center for the Study of Art, Architecture, History, and Nature, or C-SAAHN, as I like to pronounce the acronym, and ImagineLifelongLearning.com. Now, before we get started, just a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted and your video turned off. If you have a question or a comment, please type it into the chat box and we'll go through them at the end of the presentation as time allows. We are recording this program, so you can watch it again later on the Downtown Central Library's Facebook page and YouTube channels. And please, we hope you share the link with others. Now on to our featured speaker. Joining us today to discuss Uncommon Prophets, Imagining Freedom in the Age of Revolution is Dr. Kari Winter. We had multiple technology problems last week during the snowstorm when the city closed down at noon, and including the library. And are pleased Dr. Winter was available to present this week. Now, we hope a future show will feature the superintendent of Buffalo Public Schools that was scheduled for today. But as it turns out, Dr. William Knight was summoned to Albany for budget discussions. And as a result, we're looking to reschedule that program sometime in May. Now, Kari Winter is a professor of American Studies in the Department of Global Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University at Buffalo. Her research focuses on the history and literature of slavery and resistance, African American cultural studies, and women's literature and history from the 18th century to the present. Her books include The American Dreams of John B. Prentice, Slave Trader. Also, The Blind African Slave, or Memoirs of Boy Ray Rue. Brinch, who was nicknamed Jeffrey Brace. And the third book, Subjects of Slavery, Agents of Change, Women in Power in Gothic Novels and Slave Narratives, 1790 through 1865. Kari has taught at UB since 2003 and has been a Chautauquan for 20 years. So it's my delight to re-welcome Dr. Kari Winter on a very sunny day here in Buffalo compared to last Tuesday. Kari, welcome back. Take it away.
Hey, thanks so much, Dennis. And to everybody at the library, Hassan and Joy. And thanks for everyone who's shown up this week. So hopefully the slides are going to work. Okay, sorry. So Dennis had pitched this as a kind of Buffalo Chautauqua conversation. So I just want to start with a shout out to the Chautauqua Institution, which I view as one of the most unique, awesome, and democratic sites in the United States. So as someone whose research focuses on the 18th and 19th centuries, I would like in my brief talk today to connect our current age of conflict to two previous upheavals in American history, the Revolution and the Civil War. People often approach history with either an assumption of social progress that offers a facile confidence that we're moving forward toward ever-increasing enlightenment, or an idea of social decline that offers a romanticized, whitewashed picture of a past golden age from which we have fallen. I view American history in contrast as a process of continual struggle between the forces of unjust power and the desire for justice and democracy. We can see this struggle not only between different social groups, but also within individual people like ourselves who exhibit contradictory impulses. Many of us want power and money while simultaneously wanting to live in a just, equitable society. In the late 18th century, intellectuals and activists on both sides of the Atlantic were questioning deeply how to build a better society. What constitutes the social good? Noah Webster articulated a widespread vision when he wrote in 1793, "If that nation is the happiest, which with industry enjoys a full supply of the comforts and conveniences of life, then that government and those institutions which distribute and secure to the greatest number of people the greatest portion of these enjoyments will forever be the best." He did not mean that the majority should secure comforts and conveniences by exploiting the labor of a minority. Rather, he upheld the idea of the common good as the one which is the most widely inclusive. He observed that the institution of slavery not only injured the enslaved, but also corrupted the morals and diminished the industriousness of the elites. For much of my life, I believed that the core concept of American democracy, that all men are created equal, was an aspiration toward which we were slowly making progress. I grew up amid the horrors and transformational hopefulness of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the anti-war movement. From the mid-1960s to the mid-2010s, women and people of color gained unprecedented levels of opportunity and access. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 reinforced the sense that true democracy would be realized in our lifetimes. But instead, we find ourselves in an era of savage economic injustice. The Ohio politician Dennis Kucinich observed in 2017, "Our political economy is structured to create poverty and inequality. 19 of every $20 of new wealth created goes to the top 1%. The top 1% has more wealth than the bottom 90%. In the intervening years, the situation has become so extreme that President Biden warned us in his farewell address on January 15th. Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead." We have plummeted into a situation akin to that observed by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when, in August 1967, he declared, "We still need some Paul Revere of conscience to alert every hamlet and every village of America that revolution is still at hand." King was invoking Paul Revere's Midnight Ride as it was mythically portrayed by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in a poem published in January 1861, on the very day that South Carolina seceded from the Union. Longfellow's poem succeeded in inspiring courage and strength in the hearts of millions of readers who cherished the vision of democracy and longed for freedom to triumph over slavery. In January 2025, we can repeat King's call. We still need some Paul Revere of conscience to alert every hamlet and every village of America that revolution is still at hand. But to advance the fight for freedom, we need to remember the Revolutionary era more accurately. When Paul Revere described his ride to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock that the British were coming, he recalled a frightful moment when he spotted two British soldiers at a key intersection where Mark was hung in chains. This moment has profound symbolic resonance. Who was Mark? Why was he hung in chains? Why did Revere connect his freedom ride with a gruesome spectacle of violence? 21 years before the outbreak of the revolution, Mark, an enslaved man held in bondage by a Captain Codman, had conspired with two enslaved women, Phyllis and Phoebe, to end the cruelty of their oppression by killing their enslaver. Under English law, their crime was a form of treason because Codman was Mark's master, so murdering him was akin to killing a king. A woman in the 18th century could also be convicted of petite treason if she killed her husband, who was legally defined as her sovereign. Mark's accomplice, Phyllis, was burned alive, a particularly excruciating form of execution. His other accomplice, Phoebe, was sold out of the colony. However, the colonial authorities wanted Mark's execution to serve as an enduring source of terror and awe. Therefore, they hanged and gibbeted him. Gibbeting was a ghastly practice of hanging a body in chains and suspending it as a public spectacle. Paul Revere was 21 years old when Mark was executed and may have joined the throngs of people who witnessed it. In any case, Mark's gibbeted corpse hung suspended in chains near Charleston Common for more than 20 years. If the primary target of the ghastly spectacle was the enslaved, the practice of public torture and execution was a long-standing imperial tool of shock and awe that served to impress the power of authority on all members of society. The effects of terror and trauma varied. Some spectators were horrified and enraged. Some mistook sadism for divine justice, and some were moved to worship power rather than uphold ethical principles. Imperial society had many ways to reward people, especially white men, who developed a lust for violence. In short, the compounding effects of economic, psychological, and physical violence perpetrated by the monarchy, or more precisely, the colonial oligarchy, fostered the worst demons rather than the better angels in human nature. The question that has motivated most of my research for the past 40 years is this: how did some people find the spiritual strength to resist tyranny and to affirm the value of love, kindness, and justice, despite the omnipresence of violent injustice? We can discern the outlines of the conspiracy of Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe from court records and a 1755 broadsheet published as Mark's Criminal Confessions. According to William L. Andrews, the foremost authority on the genre of slave narratives, the last and dying words of Mark is the earliest extant slave narrative published in North America. Based on his narrative and the court records, the historian Jared Ross Hardesty has argued that Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe determined to poison their enslaver because they felt he neglected a number of rights and duties. Above all, they believed that they had the right to live with their spouses and children and to be free from sexual and physical abuse. Adopting a logic similar to what their white compatriots would argue 10 years later when protesting against the Stamp Act, they believed that despite living in a state of subjection, they had rights and their master had duties. While I could spend more time analyzing the fascinating stories of Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe, the core issue I want to highlight is crystallized in the image that Paul Revere provides of riding for freedom at the site of Mark's execution. At the crux of the American Revolution is a question of who is entitled to the fruits of their own labor, who is entitled to their own body, who has a right to be free from violence, who is entitled to the fruits of their reproductive labor, which is to say, their children, who is entitled to representation and taxation, who is entitled to a voice in how taxes are spent, who is entitled to equal protection and equal accountability under the law. I hope you can see that these questions are still urgently important and alive in the United States today. In authoring the Bill of Rights, the founders understood that economic violence and exploitation are connected to physical violence. They had witnessed all too often the cruel and unusual punishments devised by tyrants to terrorize their subjects into submission. They had witnessed all too often the bloody wars waged by imperial powers to engorge their lust for dominance and luxury. They understood that the only way to win their rights was to work together for the common good. The question was then and has remained, who is included in the common good? Historians define the American paradox as the ways that notions of freedom flourished alongside the realities of slavery. No one better exemplifies this paradox than Thomas Jefferson, who in the public sphere articulated and practiced exceptionally democratic ideals, while in the private sphere he relished reigning as an absolute monarch over his Monticello dominion. His political life elevated civic freedom, aspiring to create an egalitarian commons for all white male citizens. The explicit promise of the white male commons is that it would enable every white man to be the king of his own castle, to exercise in private the type of sovereign freedom that King George enjoyed in the British Empire. They could do as they pleased, extracting with impunity whatever resources they desired from the bodies and minds of wives, children, servants, slaves, and the land. Unfortunately, I see in this model many people in the United States today. In Boston, Samuel Adams, the most influential architect of revolutionary ideas, had a very different vision than Jefferson. In 1740, at the age of 18, he witnessed his father and many other people across the class spectrum financially destroyed and socially humiliated by capricious, abrupt, and heavy-handed shifts in the Crown's banking policies. Young Samuel developed an unshakable disdain for both money and tyranny. He valued women and children. He detested slavery and worked for its abolition, and he did not value material possessions. John Hancock was a different story. When revolutionary sentiment began to build in 1764, he had just become Boston's wealthiest man through inheriting his uncle Thomas Hancock's fortune. Extremely successful in the West India trade and transatlantic trade, Thomas had built his fortune by currying favor and business from the crown while simultaneously circumventing royal taxes and duties through smuggling. He was not heavily invested in the slave trade, but he profited heavily from it. And I just want to underscore what it meant to be involved in the West India and the transatlantic trade. So here you just see some records from the mid-18th century. This is from the port of Bridgetown in Barbados, and has the names of ship captains and ships bringing in slaves from Africa, and the human cargo varied from a handful of people to hundreds of people imported in the 1750s. And the way the trade worked is this document says very explicitly, from Africa, we import Negroes. To the northern colonies, we export, and then gives a list of goods, such as bread, flour, pork, corn, etc. And then from Boston and so on, we import horses, sheep, fish. And so this trade was all interconnected. And it was the foundation of the modern global economy. So Thomas Hancock built an enormous estate, and his own personal estate also exploited the labor of at least 3 white servants and 4 black slaves. Thomas built a grand stone manor graced by expansive pleasure gardens and orchards atop Beacon Hill, where it could be seen from both land and sea. Like his uncle, John Hancock relished luxury and the ostentatious display of social status. Even the wealthiest of his associates tended to view him as a foppish dandy. He prided himself in extravagant clothes and often had his portrait painted. When confronted with what colonials viewed as the Crown's outrageous tax schemes, such as the Stamp Act, John Hancock's first question appears to have been, what is more financially profitable for my business empire, resistance or submission? Samuel Adams helped persuade him of the necessity of rebelling. Once he was on the road to resistance, John slowly grew, intellectually, morally, and politically, eventually committing himself to a common good, in other words, to social justice. While Samuel Adams excelled at building resistance to tyranny, many historians believe the American Revolution would not have happened without his intellectual and organizational leadership. He faltered when it came time to build structures of governance after the Revolution, laws, policies, and institutions. In the early days of the American Republic, he became a crotchety relic. Hancock, in contrast, grew into a more compassionate person and effective politician. The profound loss and displacement that he had experienced at the age of 8 due to the death of his father and adoption by his uncle was reinforced by multiple losses in his middle age, including the deaths of his children. According to Brooke Barbier, he became a traitor to his class, often siding with the poor and middling. Twice elected governor of Massachusetts, he agreed to a salary reduction and fought for debt relief for the struggling masses. He was instrumental in getting the Bill of Rights added to the United States Constitution. Disliked and distrusted by most members of the elite, he was loved by the poor and middling, who sometimes called him King Hancock, not because he embodied tyrannical power, but because he listened to, cared about, and worked for their common welfare. Interesting as I find the so-called founders, they are not the heroes of my story. The most admirable members of the Revolutionary era were those who persevered in upholding humane virtues despite being subjected to the most horrific violence. Consider, for instance, the spiritual strength of a small girl who arrived in Boston on a sunny July day in 1761 after enduring the terror and trauma of being ripped from her family in West Africa and enduring the tortures of the Middle Passage. She was judged to be about 7 years old because she was tiny and missing her front baby teeth. The captain of the slave ship, called the Phyllis, considered her a refuse slave, meaning a commodity with little market value. She was purchased cheaply by a merchant and tailor named John Wheatley as a gift for his wife, Susanna. They dressed their little Phyllis Wheatley in the type of maid's clothes that would mark them as an affluent family. Little Phyllis may have accompanied John Wheatley on his visits as a tailor to John Hancock's mansion. Thus, she may have assisted in sewing the clothes of the wealthiest couple in Boston. No one could have imagined that 12 years later, in 1773, Hancock would join a group of 18 prominent men in attesting that Phyllis Wheatley had written a marvelous book of poems, the first literary work published by an African-American writer, one that propelled Phyllis to transatlantic fame and enduring historic significance. You can see here just in the past, in the 21st century, some of the books that have been published about Phyllis Wheatley, including just in 2023, a really mind-bogglingly fantastic biography by David Wallstrecker. Around the time that Hancock inherited his uncle's vast fortune, an enslaved young man named Jeffrey Brace disembarked from Captain Isaac Mills' frigate in Boston Harbor and slowly walked into the crowded North End, his body a testament to the bottomless viciousness of people who give themselves over to the lust for power and money. His ankles were circled with scars from the ropes and chains that had cut into his skin during the Middle Passage and festered with maggots in Barbados. His back was covered with scars from merciless whippings. He was suffering from several wounds received during the 7 Years' War. When he was forced to work as an enslaved sailor soldier in the British Navy, he had endured desperate hunger and thirst. Most scarring of all, though, were the psychological wounds of separation from his family, country, religion, and language. He had been forced to witness ghastly rapes, tortures, starvations, and murders, even of young children. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, his last port of call before Boston, Captain Mills had considered selling Jeffrey Brace to a man named Paddle, who, Brace would later recall, took hold of my nose and chin, opened my mouth as a jockey would a horse's, in order to see my age or to insult me. While my mouth was open, he spit a cud of tobacco into it, which made me sick. I sat down and wept all day. The horrors of this symbolic rape underscores once again the atrocities that people will lust to invent and commit when their society grants them tyrannical power and impunity. The miracle of someone like Jeffrey Brace is that he possessed and sustained a spiritual light that outlasted his oppressors and still shines in today's darkness. In 1777, he enlisted in the Continental Army, and he fought until the war's end alongside thousands of other Black soldiers, as well as diverse white, Indian, and transnational soldiers. But what makes him truly remarkable is that after the Revolution, he devoted his life to building. With help from friends and loved ones, he built a farm, a marriage, a family, a memoir, and a regional anti-slavery movement. If Mark, Phyllis, Phoebe, Phyllis Wheatley, and Jeffrey Brace found the courage and fortitude to resist the violent oligarchy of their time, I am confident that we can manage to resist the savage oligarchy of our time. Thank you.
Kari, thank you. You give us much to ponder. You started with images from Chautauqua, and gives me a chance to mention that this program, this Imagine Buffalo program, is a component of an idea that I've been exploring called the Buffalo Chautauqua idea, as you referenced. And I've always seen in Chautauqua this 9-week retreat area where people of all ages, families, young families, more elderly folks, have a chance to hear from speakers on both sides of issues, religions, hear from others, and especially on the history side, the archivist there, John Schmitz, relating Chautauqua's role post-Civil War. It was founded in 1874, with America's role. And it just struck me that Buffalo, if it could connect with that summertime all year long, with its cultural resources, its universities, its colleges, would have interest in such things as history. So my point is really, yes, it's a statement of my journey, but it strikes me you represent that journey in connecting the past with the present, which you've done in this presentation and in your research. Care to comment on that? Because we've got these big events coming up. 200th anniversary of the Erie Canal gets you back to 1825. And next year, the 250th anniversary of America's founding from 1776 with our Declaration of Independence. Just your thoughts on the value of connecting yesterday with today and tomorrow.
Thanks so much for that. I find the Chautauqua Institution really inspiring in the sense of what people can create when they really have that aspiration to live the fullest possible life in the richest kind of way, with visual arts, with music, with conversations, including the more inclusive, the better. So its inclusivity has grown over time. Still the problem that it's very expensive, but starting in 1874 after the incredible devastation, incredible violence of the Civil War, and maintaining that vision for 150 years now, um, of becoming, cultivating, creating that utopian space, committed to the natural world, to the lake, to sports, to the outdoors, and to all the spiritual arts, like that whole package of what makes life good, what makes life rewarding. How can we have conversations with each other that include disagreement and are not threatened by disagreement, but see diversity, including diversity of opinion, as something that helps us to live fully. Um, and I think that one of the ways we can take hope from the Chautauqua movement um, is the way in which society can change for the better quite quickly, just as it can fall apart quite quickly. So if you look at some of the devastating legislation and Supreme Court decisions that made the Civil War inevitable, um, and you can see an echo of that in the American Revolution. I mean, if the British Parliament hadn't made devastating decisions, pursuing a very expensive imperial war, then trying to fund it from the colonies that had already sacrificed the lives of many of their citizens to fight the wars, and then they placing these heavy taxes, and it was those terrible legislative and judicial decisions that set the colonies on the path to revolution. And we can see, if we look at the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and we looked at the Dred Scott decision of 1854, those two acts increased tensions, made a possibly peaceful resolution of differences impossible. And the devastation, the hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost, is very devastating. Then you think about how quickly thereafter, 1874, people who want something better, on the lake of Lake Chautauqua, on Chautauqua Lake and the shores of Chautauqua Lake, establish a movement that Teddy Roosevelt would call, the most American thing in America, kind of that vision of what we can be. So part of the reason I mean, basically the reason I find it so inspiring and necessary, like it's a kind of nutrition to study history, is that not only do you come to understand the past, but you also understand what we are capable of doing for the good. When you find people who have the courage and strength, like some of the people I cited, their lives are so much more difficult than ours. There's so much more reason for discouragement and despair and terror. And yet they created a really priceless, invaluable, precious legacy for humanity that we can take inspiration from.
Well, thank you. Let's just see, Sean, do we have some questions? We're a little over on our time, but let's try to get as many, if possible, into it.
Hi. So I've gotten a couple of questions here. We have a viewer who has asked, besides electing a new government, how can we change this anarchy?
Hazen, good question. Good.
I think that is an absolutely key question for right now, for these times. And I think that there's so many things that we can do, but one of the most important things I think right now is to show up in your own place, like show up in our local spaces and articulate your values and be part of the conversation. Um, Form social networks that can overcome some of the loneliness and malaise that is really harming us right now. And have those conversations. Again, the kind of Chautauqua idea, let's talk. Let's celebrate what's good in life. Let's build up what's good in life. And I just think continuing to seek for ways to foster and support what is good, to emphasize like what are the nutrients, what are the forms of rest, what are the forms of rejuvenation that we need and that we can help provide for others.
Awesome. And I have another question here. It starts with excellent presentation. Question, while the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, which outlaws slavery except as a criminal punishment, was ratified in 1865, slavery and similar systems are still practiced and relevant now. In your opinion, what current systems or circumstances do you see parallels in with historical slavery and anti-slavery movements?
That's really a huge question, a little bit overwhelming. Unfortunately, I will say I see so many parallels and that each one is really significant. Each of us can't fight on every front all of the time. So it's important to really choose like what you can make a difference on. But back to those questions of who has the right to control their own body. Like we all deserve bodily integrity. We all deserve freedom from violence. And I also just want to underscore with each of the issues, each of the historical eras that we've been talking about, there's tremendous economic violence. So fighting for economic justice is also absolutely crucial. And I'm really sorry, but I have got to go. I have to take my mother to a doctor's appointment.
Well, that's a good way to finish. We have to go as well. So, Kari, I'll thank you so much again for your patience in dealing with the weather and with this program to come right back and provide all those great graphics and the stories. So, thank you, folks. Thank you very much for joining us. We have next week. Hope you come back on February 4th, when we'll be joined by the Honorable Clifford Bell and Ellen Harris Harvey for their discussion of 2025 Together as One, The Journey Continues. Now, that's appropriately to open February's Black History Month programs taking place at libraries and throughout our region. So I'm Dennis Galucki. Be well and good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kari.